"I'll give you 10 if you solve it in 1 minute," mocked the billionaire. But the poor girl silenced all. "Before we continue, please comment on which city you are watching from." The crystalline chandeliers of Hassan Al-Fayed's penthouse cast dancing shadows across the marble floors, their light reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city below. At 38, Hassan had built an empire that spanned continents, his sharp mind and ruthless business acumen transforming him from a middle-class boy in Cairo into one of the world's most influential billionaires. Tonight, however, his usual confidence was cracking. The massive blackboard dominating the eastern wall of his entertainment hall had become a monument to frustration. Chalk dust coated the expensive Persian rugs as equations sprawled across the dark surface like mathematical hieroglyphics. For 6 grueling hours, Hassan's team of elite mathematicians, professors from MIT, Cambridge, and the Sorbonne, had wrestled with calculations that could unlock his latest investment strategy. Each failed attempt represented millions of dollars in frozen assets, opportunities slipping through his fingers like sand. "This is impossible," muttered Dr. Richardson from Harvard, wiping sweat from his brow as he stared at the incomprehensible maze of numbers and symbols. Hassan's jaw tightened. He hadn't built his fortune by accepting impossibility. The solution had to exist. It was just a matter of finding the right mind to crack it. His guests, fellow billionaires, investment partners, and academic luminaries watched with a mixture of curiosity and concern. This wasn't just about mathematics anymore. It was about Hassan's reputation, his image as the man who could solve any puzzle, overcome any obstacle. Outside, the city hummed with life, unaware that in this ivory tower of wealth and privilege, the brilliant mind that would change everything was about to walk through the door, asking for nothing more than a meal and a chance to survive another day. The mahogany doors to Hassan's penthouse swung open as his personal assistant Marcus entered with a troubled expression. Behind him, barely visible in his shadow, stood a small figure that seemed to shrink further into the opulent surroundings. Grace Williams, 6 years old and wearing clothes that had seen too many washings, clutched a worn backpack to her chest as her wide eyes took in the impossible luxury surrounding her. "Sir," Marcus began hesitantly, "security found her outside the service entrance. She says she's looking for work or food." The distaste in his voice was barely concealed. This child didn't belong in their world of crystal and gold. Hassan barely glanced up from his heated discussion with Dr. Petrov about matrix transformations. "Handle it, Marcus. Give her something from the kitchen and send her away. We don't have time for charity cases tonight." But Grace didn't move. Her gaze had locked onto the blackboard, and something extraordinary happened. The chaos of numbers and symbols seemed to organize itself in her mind, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. She had always seen patterns where others saw confusion. In the homeless shelter where she'd spent the last 3 months after her grandmother's death, she'd solved crossword puzzles that stumped the adults. She'd helped other children with their homework, explaining complex concepts in ways that made perfect sense. But this was different. This was beautiful in its complexity. "The third derivative is wrong," she said softly, almost to herself. The room fell silent. 23 of the world's most brilliant minds turned to stare at the small girl who had just spoken with the confidence of a tenured professor. Dr. Richardson's chalk stopped mid-stroke, and Hassan's conversation died on his lips. "What did you say?" Hassan's voice carried a dangerous edge. He wasn't sure if he was more angry at the interruption or intrigued by the audacity. Grace took a small step forward, her hunger momentarily forgotten. "The third derivative. In the second equation cluster, it's creating a recursive loop that makes the whole system unsolvable." Her voice was clearer now, though she still seemed overwhelmed by the attention of so many important-looking adults. Dr. Chen from Stanford University laughed nervously. "Child, these are advanced mathematical concepts that PhD students struggle with. Perhaps you should—" "She's right," Dr. Petrov interrupted, his Russian accent thick with amazement. He approached the blackboard, his finger tracing the equations. "My God, she's absolutely right. How did we miss this?" Hassan's eyes narrowed as he studied the girl more carefully. Her clothes were threadbare, her sneakers had holes, and her dark hair needed washing. But her eyes, Her eyes held an intelligence that seemed to burn with an inner light. It reminded him of something, someone, himself, decades ago, when he was just another poor kid with impossible dreams. The room erupted in whispered conversations as the mathematicians began re-examining their work through the lens of Grace's observation. Hassan felt something shift inside his chest, a mixture of curiosity and something else he couldn't quite name. This wasn't possible. A 6-year-old child couldn't understand mathematics that challenged the world's greatest minds. Yet here she was, having identified in seconds what they had missed in hours. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Grace," she replied, then added with the heartbreaking politeness of a child who had learned early that manners might be the difference between kindness and cruelty. "Grace Williams. Sir, I'm sorry for interrupting. I've been hungry for a while, and my mom always said that if you're hungry, you should ask for help." The mention of her mother brought a shadow across her young face, and Hassan felt an unexpected pang of recognition. He remembered his own mother's advice, given in their small apartment in Cairo. "Education is the only wealth they can never take from you, Habibi. Learn everything you can." Hassan moved closer to the blackboard, then looked back at Grace with new interest. "Tell me, Grace Williams, what else do you see when you look at these equations?" Grace approached the blackboard with the careful steps of someone entering a sacred space. Her small fingers traced the air above the equations, as if she were reading a story written in a language only she understood. The room held its collective breath, watching this surreal scene unfold. A homeless child conducting a silent symphony of numbers, while some of the world's most educated minds looked on in stunned silence. "Grace, it's like a garden that's all tangled up," Grace said, her voice gaining confidence as she lost herself in the mathematics. "See here." She pointed to a complex integral. "This part is trying to grow, but it's being strangled by this part over here. If you prune away the unnecessary complications—" She paused, looking around the room at the sea of expensive suits and expectant faces. Could I have some chalk, please?" Dr. Richardson hesitated, looking to Hassan for permission. The billionaire nodded slowly, his businessman's instinct warring with his curiosity. This was either an elaborate hoax, or he was witnessing something extraordinary. Grace took the chalk with reverent care, as if it were made of gold. Her small hand moved across the blackboard with surprising precision, not erasing the existing work, but creating a new section beside it. She began writing symbols and numbers with a fluency that defied her age, her movements becoming more confident with each stroke. "The problem isn't the equations themselves," she explained, her voice taking on a teacher-like quality that was both endearing and unsettling. "It's that you're trying to solve them in the wrong order. It's like trying to get dressed by putting your shoes on before your socks." A few guests chuckled nervously at the simple analogy that somehow made perfect sense. Hassan watched, transfixed, as Grace systematically broke down the complex mathematical framework into manageable components. She was right. They had been approaching the problem with brute force when elegance was required. Her method was revolutionary in its simplicity, bypassing hours of computation by recognizing patterns that the trained mathematicians had missed entirely. "In Algeria, we have a saying," Hassan murmured to himself, loud enough for only Dr. Petrov to hear. "Sometimes the clearest view comes from the highest mountain or the deepest valley." As Grace worked, her story began to emerge in fragments. She mentioned her grandmother, who had taught her to see patterns in everything, in quilts, in music, in the way numbers danced together. She spoke of libraries where she had hidden when the shelters were full, reading textbooks that older children had discarded. Her education had been unconventional, born of necessity, and nurtured by an insatiable curiosity that hunger couldn't diminish. "There," Grace said finally, stepping back from the blackboard. In less than 15 minutes, she had reorganized the entire problem into a framework that revealed the solution pathway with stunning clarity. Now the big equation can breathe. The room erupted into chaos. Dr. Chen was frantically taking photographs of Grace's work with his phone. Dr. Richardson was muttering calculations under his breath, his face pale with amazement. Hassan's other guests were whispering among themselves, some suspicious, others awed, but Hassan himself remained focused on Grace. She had solved in minutes what had stumped his experts for hours, And she had done it while obviously weak from hunger, while surrounded by strangers in an intimidating environment. The implications were staggering, not just for his current investment crisis, but for what this child could become with proper nurturing and education. "Grace," Hassan said, his voice cutting through the noise. "That was remarkable. Tell me, what would you do if someone gave you unlimited resources to learn anything you wanted?" Grace's eyes lit up with a brightness that transformed her entire face. "I would learn how to fix things," she said without hesitation. "Not just math things, but people things. Like why some kids don't have enough food, or why some schools don't have books, or why some families have to live in cars." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "My grandmother always said that smart people have a responsibility to help make the world better." Hassan felt something crack open in his chest, a wall he had built around his heart years ago when success had taught him to view others as either assets or obstacles. This child, who had every reason to be bitter about her circumstances, dreamed not of wealth or comfort for herself, but of using knowledge to heal the world's wounds. He made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The silence that followed Grace's words stretched across the opulent room like a bridge between two worlds, one of privilege and power, the other of struggle and hope. Hassan stood motionless, his dark eyes fixed on the child who had just articulated a vision of purpose that most adults never achieved. Around them, the mathematical elite continued their excited discussions about Grace's solution, but Hassan heard none of it. He was remembering another child decades ago who had stood in a cramped apartment in Cairo, promising his dying mother that he would use his mind to build something meaningful. "Everyone out," Hassan said quietly, but his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to instant obedience. The room fell silent again. "Marcus, escort our guests to the dining room. Dinner will be served in an hour." Dr. Richardson looked up from his frantic note-taking. "Hassan, we need to document this methodology, verify the calculations." "Now," Hassan's voice cut like a blade through glass. His guests exchanged uncertain glances, but began filing out, their conversations moving in hushed tones toward the corridor. Marcus hesitated at the doorway, clearly uncomfortable leaving his employer alone with the child, but a single look from Hassan sent him scurrying after the others. When the massive doors closed with a soft thud, Hassan and Grace were alone. The child stood small and uncertain beside the blackboard, her chalk-stained fingers still clutching the piece of chalk as if it were a talisman. The mathematical equations seemed to glow in the chandelier light, a testament to the extraordinary mind housed in such a fragile, underfed body. "Sit," Hassan said, gesturing toward one of the leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's cars. Grace perched on the edge, her feet dangling several inches from the floor, her backpack still clutched protectively to her chest. Hassan moved to his private bar and poured himself a scotch. 25-year-old Macallan that he barely tasted. His mind was racing through calculations of a different sort: potential, opportunity, risk, and something harder to quantify: redemption. He had spent years accumulating wealth and power, building walls around himself that kept the world's pain at a manageable distance. But this child had walked through those walls as easily as she had solved his impossible equation. "Grace," he began, then paused. How did one speak to a 6-year-old who had just demonstrated the intellectual capacity of a graduate student? "Tell me about your family." The brightness faded from Grace's eyes like a candle being snuffed out. "It's just me now," she said in a voice that was trying very hard to be brave. "My mom died when I was 4. Car accident. Then I lived with Grandma Rosa, but she got sick last year and—" Her voice trailed off and she stared at her shoes. Hassan felt that crack in his chest widen. He had built his fortune through calculated risks and cold logic, but nothing had prepared him for the devastating simplicity of a child's loss. "Ty, where have you been living since then?" "Different places," Grace said with the careful vagueness of a child who had learned that truth sometimes brought unwanted attention from social services. "Sometimes the shelter on 5th Street, sometimes with Mrs. Patterson who lives in the blue car behind the library. She's nice, but her car is really small, and sometimes there isn't room for both of us." Hassan's scotch turned to ash in his mouth. While he had been playing mathematical games with millions of dollars, this brilliant child had been sleeping in strangers, cars, and begging for food. The injustice of it hit him like a physical blow. The equation you solved tonight, Hassan said, setting down his glass and moving closer to Grace's chair. It unlocks an investment strategy worth approximately $400 million. Grace's eyes widened, but not with greed, with confusion. $400 million? That's a lot of food, and houses, and schools. Yes, Hassan said simply. It is. He knelt down beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level. This close, he could see the intelligence burning in her dark eyes, but also the exhaustion, the constant vigilance of someone who had learned too young that the world could be cruel and unpredictable. Grace, I want to make you an offer, Hassan said. Oh, it's not a joke this time and not a challenge, a real offer. She waited, her small hands folded in her lap with a composure that broke his heart. I want to adopt you, he said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. He hadn't planned this, hadn't thought it through, but suddenly nothing had ever felt more right. I want to give you a home, an education, everything you need to develop your extraordinary mind. But more than that, I want you to help me remember something I lost along the way. Grace tilted her head, her expression serious and considering. What did you lose? Hassan smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he had worn in years. The understanding that wealth and power are only tools. What matters is what you build with them. He stood and walked back to the blackboard, studying Grace's elegant solution. You see patterns that others miss. You simplify what seems impossibly complex. And most importantly, you dream of using knowledge to help others, rather than just accumulating it for yourself. These are gifts that the world desperately needs. Grace was quiet for a long moment, her 6-year-old mind working through concepts that would challenge adults. If I said yes, she said finally, would I have to stop being me? Would I have to become fancy and forget about people like Mrs. Patterson? Hassan's heart clenched at the question. This child, who had every reason to grab at the chance for security and comfort, was worried about losing her compassion and connection to those still struggling. She was afraid that privilege might corrupt her purpose. No, Grace, Hassan said firmly. In fact, I'm hoping you'll teach me to be more like you. I've spent so many years building walls around my heart that I almost forgot there's a world outside them that needs healing. He returned to his position beside her chair. But I won't lie to you. The life I'm offering would be different. You'd live in luxury, attend the best schools, have access to resources most people can't imagine. The temptation to forget your origins, to lose yourself in comfort, will be real. It will require strength to stay true to your values. Grace nodded solemnly, as if she understood the weight of what he was offering and what it would cost. My grandma used to say that trees with deep roots can grow very tall without falling over. Your grandmother was a wise woman, Hassan said. What else did she teach you? She said that God gives some people extra gifts not to make them better than others, but to make them more responsible for helping others. She said if you have a gift and you waste it, that's the real sin. Hassan closed his eyes briefly, feeling the truth of those words settle into his bones. He had been given extraordinary intelligence and opportunities, and what had he done with them? Built an empire that served primarily his own ego and comfort. This child, with nothing but the clothes on her back, had a clearer understanding of purpose than he had achieved in nearly 4 decades of life. Grace, he said, opening his eyes to meet hers, I believe your grandmother was right, and I believe you and I could help each other remember what our gifts are really for. Grace was quiet for another long moment, her young mind working through the enormous decision she was being asked to make. Finally, she looked up at him with eyes that seemed far older than her years. Mr. Hassan, she said, if I came to live with you, could we maybe help Mrs. Patterson get a real house? And could we maybe figure out why some kids don't have enough to eat even though there's so much food in the world? Hassan felt tears prick at his eyes, tears he hadn't shed since his mother's death. Yes, Grace, he said, his voice rough with emotion. We could do exactly that. 3 months after that life-changing evening, Hassan's penthouse had undergone a transformation that would have been unimaginable to anyone who had known him before Grace entered his life. The stark, museum-like perfection of his former living space had given way to something warmer, more human. Children's books sat alongside financial journals on his coffee table. A corner of his study had been converted into Grace's learning space, complete with multiple blackboards, art supplies, and a telescope pointed toward the night sky. But the most profound changes were invisible to casual observers. Hassan had discovered that raising a brilliant, compassionate child was perhaps the most complex challenge he had ever undertaken, and certainly the most rewarding. "The integration is still wrong," Grace said from her position at one of the smaller blackboards, her voice carrying the confident authority she had developed over months of advanced tutoring. She was working through calculus problems that would challenge undergraduate students, but her approach remained uniquely her own, intuitive, elegant, and often revolutionary in its simplicity. Hassan looked up from his laptop, where he had been reviewing proposals for the Hassan Grace Foundation, the charitable organization they had established together. Grace had insisted on having her name included, not out of ego, but because she wanted to be reminded every day of her responsibility to help others. "Show me," Hassan said, setting aside his work. This had become their evening routine. Grace would work through increasingly complex mathematical and scientific concepts, while Hassan handled the business side of their growing philanthropic efforts. But regardless of what else demanded his attention, when Grace needed help or wanted to share a discovery, everything else stopped. Grace's explanation of the integration error was characteristically clear and innovative. She had developed her own system of visualization that turned abstract mathematical concepts into spatial relationships she could manipulate in her mind. Her tutor, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, had initially been skeptical of these unorthodox methods, but had quickly become Grace's strongest advocate when her student consistently arrived at correct solutions through pathways that defied conventional mathematical education. "Have you given any thought to the university partnership proposal?" Hassan asked as Grace finished her demonstration. Grace nodded seriously. At 6 years old, she was actively involved in decisions about educational initiatives that would affect thousands of children. Her insights often surprised the adults involved in these discussions, cutting through bureaucratic complexity to identify practical solutions. "I think we should start with the schools in my old neighborhood," Grace said. "Not because I'm being sentimental, but because if we can make it work there, we can make it work anywhere." Hassan smiled at her matter-of-fact assessment. Grace had an uncanny ability to separate emotional considerations from practical ones, a skill that served her well in their foundation work. They had already launched 3 major initiatives: a program providing advanced mathematical education to underprivileged children, a network of community learning centers, and a scholarship fund specifically designed for kids aging out of foster care. "Mrs. Patterson called today," Hassan mentioned casually, watching Grace's face light up. They had indeed helped the woman who had shared her car with Grace, setting her up in a small apartment and connecting her with job training programs. Mrs. Patterson had become Grace's first success story and remained one of her closest friends. "How is she doing with the computer classes?" Grace asked, her excitement evident. "She's apparently the top student in her program," Hassan replied. "She wants to thank you again for encouraging her to pursue it." Grace beamed with pride, and Hassan felt that now familiar warmth in his chest. Watching Grace succeed was satisfying, but watching her help others succeed was something else entirely, a joy he had never experienced before becoming her father. The adoption had been finalized just 2 weeks earlier, a process expedited by Hassan's resources, but made meaningful by the genuine bond that had developed between them. Grace had kept her surname, Williams, but had added his as well, Grace Williams Al-Fayed, a name that bridged her past and her future, honoring both her grandmother's legacy and her new family. Hassan's, Grace said, using the name she had chosen for him after deciding that Dad felt too strange and formal titles felt too distant. "I've been thinking about the intelligence testing controversy." Hassan raised an eyebrow. Grace's exceptional abilities had attracted attention from educational psychologists and researchers who wanted to study her development. Some had pushed for extensive testing and documentation, arguing that her case could revolutionize understanding of childhood intellectual development. "What about it?" he asked. "I don't think the tests matter very much," Grace said thoughtfully. "They're trying to put a number on something that's not really about numbers. It's like trying to measure how beautiful music is by counting the notes." Hassan paused his typing, struck once again by Grace's ability to cut to the heart of complex issues. The testing debate had consumed weeks of discussion among the experts they consulted, but Grace had summarized the fundamental problem in a single metaphor. "You don't want to be tested?" he asked. Grace shrugged. "So I don't mind being tested, but I don't want the results to change anything. I don't want to be treated like a circus animal or a science experiment. I want to be treated like Grace, who happens to be good at math and wants to help people." Her clarity about her own identity continued to amaze Hassan. Despite the dramatic changes in her circumstances, Grace had maintained a grounded sense of self that kept her connected to her core values. She was certainly aware of her intellectual gifts, but she wore that awareness lightly, more interested in what she could accomplish than in being praised for her abilities. "Speaking of helping people," Hassan said, "I have something to show you." He opened a new window on his laptop and turned the screen toward Grace. The web page displayed architectural renderings of a modern, bright building surrounded by green space. "The first Grace Williams Learning Center," Hassan announced. "Construction begins next month, just 6 blocks from your old neighborhood." Grace's intake of breath was sharp and sudden. She studied the plans with the intensity she usually reserved for mathematical proofs, taking in every detail of the facility that would provide free advanced education and mentoring to children in underserved communities. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "But Hassan, are you sure about the name? People might think I'm being—" She struggled for the word. "Proud," Hassan suggested. "Grace, you solved a problem that had stumped some of the world's best mathematicians. More importantly, you've shown that extraordinary potential exists everywhere, often in the places where no one thinks to look for it. Your name on this building isn't vanity. It's a promise. A promise that every child who walks through those doors has the same potential you do and deserves the same chances you're getting." Grace was quiet for a moment, processing the weight of what he was saying. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, but I want to be involved in everything, the curriculum design, the teacher selection, all of it. This isn't just my name on a building. This is my responsibility." Hassan felt a surge of pride and something deeper, a profound respect for this extraordinary child who understood instinctively what had taken him decades to learn, that privilege was a form of debt that could only be repaid through service to others. The auditorium at Columbia University was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on screens in adjacent rooms. The prestigious Frontiers in Education Symposium had never drawn such attention. But then again, they had never featured a 7-year-old keynote speaker who was revolutionizing how the world thought about intelligence, education, and social responsibility. Grace stood at the podium, which had been adjusted to accommodate her small stature. Wearing a simple blue dress that Hassan had learned was her favorite because it's the color of the sky when anything is possible. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her expression was serious, but not intimidated, as she looked out at an audience that included Nobel laureates, university presidents, and educational policymakers from around the globe. "Most adults," Grace began, her clear voice carrying easily through the sophisticated sound system, "think that being smart means knowing a lot of facts or being able to solve complicated problems really fast. But I think being smart means asking better questions." Hassan watched from the front row, his heart swelling with pride and something deeper, a profound gratitude for the ways this extraordinary child continued to reshape his understanding of what mattered in life. Beside him sat Mrs. Patterson, who had become Grace's honorary grandmother and Hassan's unexpected friend, her computer certification program having led to a job with the foundation where her experience with homelessness provided invaluable perspective on their outreach efforts. "Before I learned to live with Hassan," Grace continued, "I spent a lot of time in libraries because they were warm and safe and had books. I read about all these amazing discoveries and inventions, and I noticed something interesting. The people who changed the world weren't necessarily the ones who were born knowing the most stuff. They were the ones who kept asking why and what if and how can we make this better?" The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word from this child who spoke with the wisdom of someone who had experienced both profound hardship and extraordinary opportunity. "For example," Grace said, moving away from the podium to stand closer to her audience, a habit she had developed to make her presentations feel more like conversations. "Everyone knows that there are kids who don't have enough food or good schools or safe places to live. That's a fact. But the better question is, why do we accept this as normal when we have all the resources we need to fix it? Hassan thought back to the conversation that had inspired this particular insight. Grace had been studying global economic data as part of her accelerated education program when she had made a startling observation. The amount of money spent worldwide on luxury goods in a single year exceeded what would be needed to provide quality education and basic nutrition to every child on the planet. When her tutors had praised her mathematical analysis, Grace had become frustrated. "The math is the easy part," she had said. "As to the hard part is figuring out why adults know these numbers and don't do anything about them." Now, standing before some of the most influential people in education, she was sharing that same challenge. "In the past year," Grace continued, "Hassan and I have started 3 programs together. We're not telling you about them to brag, but because we want to show you something important about how change actually happens." She moved to a large screen where her presentation slides appeared. Not the simple pictures one might expect from a child's presentation, but sophisticated data visualizations that she had created herself. "This is the Rosa Williams Learning Center," she said, showing images of the facility that had opened just 2 months earlier. "We named it after my grandmother, who taught me that everyone has gifts, even if the world doesn't always notice them. In our first 8 weeks, we identified 43 children with exceptional abilities in mathematics, science, arts, and problem-solving. These kids were all in schools that had labeled them as struggling students or behavior problems." The implications of her statement rippled through the audience. Grace was presenting evidence that traditional educational assessment was not just inadequate, but actively harmful, overlooking talent and potential on a massive scale. "Here's what we learned," Grace said, advancing to her next slide. "When you give children challenging, meaningful work and show them how their learning can help solve real problems, they don't just get smarter, they get more caring. They start seeing themselves as people who can make a difference." Hassan remembered the day Grace had reached that conclusion. She had been working with a group of 8-year-olds on a project to calculate optimal nutrition ratios for school lunch programs. Initially, several of the children had been disruptive and unfocused, but as they began to understand that their mathematical work could actually help ensure that kids in their community got better food, their entire attitude had shifted. They stayed after hours, double-checked their calculations, and presented their findings to the school board with a passion that had moved several board members to tears. "The second thing we learned," Grace continued, "is that smart kids aren't rare, they're everywhere. But a lot of them are invisible because they don't look like what people expect smart to look like." She clicked to a photo that had become iconic in educational circles, Grace herself at 6 years old, standing in Hassan's penthouse in her worn clothes and hole-filled sneakers, pointing to the mathematical equations that had stumped PhD mathematicians. "This is me on the night I met Hassan," Grace said simply. "I was hungry and homeless and asking for work or food. If Hassan had just given me a sandwich and sent me away, which is what most people would have done, none of you would be listening to me today. Not because I wouldn't still be smart, but because I wouldn't have had the opportunity to show it in a way that mattered." The auditorium was so quiet that the hum of the ventilation system seemed loud. Grace's point was landing with devastating clarity. How many other brilliant minds were being overlooked because they came packaged in poverty, in the wrong skin color, in circumstances that made society look away. "That brings me to the most important thing we've learned," Grace said, her voice growing stronger. "The biggest waste in the world isn't natural resources or money. It's human potential. Every day, kids who could grow up to cure diseases or solve climate change or create beautiful art are being told they're not smart enough, not important enough, not worth investing in." Hassan felt a familiar tightness in his throat. Grace had a gift for articulating truths that adults spent lifetimes learning to see. But more than that, she had the courage to speak those truths in rooms where they made powerful people uncomfortable. "So here's my challenge for everyone in this room," Grace said, moving back to the podium and looking directly at her audience. "Stop asking, how can we identify gifted children? And start asking, how can we create conditions where every child's gifts can emerge? Stop asking, how can we educate the smart kids? And start asking, how can we make every child smarter? And most importantly, stop asking, what can these children do for us? and start asking, what can we do for these children? The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and discomfort in equal measure. Grace had just challenged the fundamental assumptions that guided educational policy and resource allocation, and she had done it with the moral authority of someone who had lived both sides of the equation. "Questions?" Grace asked, and Hassan smiled despite the tears in his eyes. Even after conquering the academic world's most prestigious forum, she remained the curious child who believed the best learning happened through conversation. The first hand that shot up belonged to Dr. Margaret Chen, the Secretary of Education, and Hassan knew that Grace's ideas had just taken their first step from inspiration toward implementation. 2 years after Grace's Columbia University speech, the world had begun to change in ways both subtle and profound. The Williams Method TAS of education, named after Grace's grandmother, was being implemented in over 200 schools across 30 countries. But perhaps more importantly, Grace herself was evolving from a remarkable child prodigy into something unprecedented, a young leader whose influence transcended age, nationality, and traditional power structures. The private jet descended through morning clouds toward Geneva, where Grace would address the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization's emergency session on global education inequality. At 8 years old, she was the youngest person ever invited to speak before the UNESCO Assembly, but her age had long ceased to be the most interesting thing about her. "Are you nervous?" Hassan asked, looking up from his tablet where he had been reviewing the economic impact reports from their various initiatives. The Grace Williams Learning Centers had demonstrated something extraordinary. When properly resourced and thoughtfully designed, education programs could generate positive economic returns within 18 months, while simultaneously reducing crime rates, improving health outcomes, and strengthening community cohesion. Grace was curled up in her seat with a book, not the advanced mathematics texts that had dominated her reading 2 years earlier, but a collection of essays by Maya Angelou. Her intellectual development had taken an interesting turn as she had begun to seek balance between analytical thinking and emotional intelligence, between solving problems with numbers and understanding the human experiences behind those numbers. "Not nervous, exactly," Grace said thoughtfully, placing her bookmark and setting the book aside. "But I keep thinking about Amara." Hassan's expression softened. Amara was a 9-year-old girl they had met during a foundation visit to a refugee camp in Jordan. Despite having been displaced from her home in Syria and living in conditions that would challenge most adults, Amara had demonstrated exceptional ability in pattern recognition and spatial reasoning. But she had also been suffering from malnutrition and trauma-induced anxiety that made traditional learning environments impossible for her. Working with Amara had taught Grace something that all her advanced education hadn't. Intelligence meant nothing if children weren't first given safety, nutrition, and emotional support. It was a lesson that had fundamentally shifted how the Grace Williams Learning Centers operated and what Grace advocated for in her speaking engagements. "What about Amara specifically?" Hassan asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. She's not going to be in that assembly room today," Grace said. "None of the kids like her will be. They're the ones who need these changes most, but they're also the ones who have the least voice in deciding what those changes look like." This concern had been weighing on Grace for months. As her profile had grown, she had found herself increasingly surrounded by adults who wanted to learn from her and implement her ideas. But she had also become aware that her own privileged position, living in luxury with Hassan, attending elite schools, traveling the world, might be distancing her from the realities faced by children like her former self. "Which is exactly why you need to speak for them," Hassan reminded her gently. "You have something rare, Grace. You have the intellectual credibility to command attention from world leaders. But you also have the lived experience of poverty and displacement. You can bridge those worlds in ways that most advocates cannot." Grace nodded, but Hassan could see the weight of responsibility settling on her young shoulders. She had never asked to be a symbol or a spokesperson, but the world had cast her in that role, and she had chosen to embrace it because she understood the potential impact. "I've been working on something," Grace said, reaching into her backpack to pull out a tablet. "I want to show you before the speech." Hassan leaned over to look at the screen, which displayed what appeared to be a complex, interactive map. As Grace manipulated the display, layers of data appeared and disappeared. Education access rates, nutrition statistics, refugee populations, conflict zones, economic indicators, and dozens of other variables. It's a real-time visualization of educational need and opportunity, Grace explained, her voice taking on the focused intensity it always carried when she was sharing a new discovery. But watch what happens when I overlay resource allocation data. As the new layer appeared, the map transformed dramatically. Regions with the greatest educational need showed the lowest levels of resource investment, while areas with already strong educational systems received disproportionate funding and attention. The pattern is consistent across every continent, Grace continued. We keep trying to solve educational inequality by improving systems that are already working relatively well, instead of addressing the places where children have almost no access to education at all. Hassan studied the visualization with growing amazement. Grace had not just identified a problem, she had created a tool that could guide global policy decisions with unprecedented precision and clarity. "How long did this take you to develop?" he asked. "About 6 months," Grace said casually. "I've been working with Dr. Rodriguez at MIT on the statistical modeling, and the UN actually gave me access to their databases after my Columbia speech. They said they wanted to see what I could do with real global data." Hassan shook his head in wonder. While most 8-year-olds were learning multiplication tables, Grace was conducting graduate-level research that could reshape international aid policy. "There's something else," Grace said, advancing to a new section of her presentation. "I think I know why most educational reform efforts fail, even when they have good intentions and adequate funding." She pulled up a series of case studies showing education initiatives that had promised transformative results but had ultimately produced minimal impact. Hassan recognized several of them, programs that his own foundation had initially considered supporting before Grace had steered them toward different approaches. "They all make the same mistake," Grace explained. "They design solutions for average children in average circumstances, then try to scale those solutions to reach children in extraordinary circumstances. But kids who are hungry, traumatized, displaced, or living in conflict zones aren't just average kids with extra challenges. They need fundamentally different approaches." Grace clicked through to show video footage from several Grace Williams learning centers, focusing on programs designed specifically for children with trauma histories, refugee children, and kids aging out of foster care. "Look at what happens when you design education from the ground up for the children who need it most," Grace said. "Not only do those kids succeed, but the programs work better for everyone else too." Hassan watched footage of Amara, the refugee girl who had inspired so much of Grace's current thinking. 6 months after entering the specialized program Grace had designed for trauma-affected children, Amara was not just academically successful, but had become a mentor for newer arrivals at the camp. "Grace," Hassan said slowly, "I think you've just solved one of the fundamental problems in international development." Grace looked at him with the serious expression she wore when she was working through complex ideas. "The solution isn't that complicated, Hassan. It's just really hard to implement because it requires admitting that most of what we've been doing hasn't been working." As their plane began its final descent into Geneva, Hassan found himself reflecting on how much Grace had grown, not just intellectually, but in her understanding of leadership and change. She had learned that having the right answer was only the beginning. The real challenge was helping others see why their current approaches weren't sufficient and inspiring them to risk the discomfort of trying something new. "One more thing," Grace said, as they prepared for landing. "I want to announce something new today, something we haven't discussed yet." Hassan raised an eyebrow. Grace rarely made unilateral decisions about foundation matters, preferring to think through implications together before making commitments. "I want to start a program that brings children like Amara to speak at education conferences and policy meetings," Grace said, "not as case studies or examples, but as experts, as consultants, as people whose insights about what they need are more valuable than any research we could do about them." Hassan felt that familiar surge of pride mixed with awe. Grace had just proposed something that could revolutionize not just education policy, but the entire concept of who was considered qualified to participate in decisions that affected their own lives. "The Adults' Table Initiative," Hassan suggested, remembering Grace's frequent observation that important decisions were always made at the adults' table, while the people most affected by those decisions waited to be told what had been decided for them. Grace smiled, the bright, a transformative smile that had been melting hearts and changing minds for 2 years. Exactly. It's time to make the table bigger. The UNESCO Assembly Hall buzzed with an energy unlike anything Hassan had experienced in his many years of attending international conferences. Representatives from 195 countries sat in tiered rows, their attention focused on the small figure at the podium who was methodically dismantling decades of conventional wisdom about education, development and international aid. Grace had been speaking for 20 minutes, and Hassan could see the moment when her words had shifted from polite curiosity to uncomfortable recognition in the minds of her listeners. She was not just presenting problems, she was providing solutions that would require fundamental changes in how global organizations operated. "The data is clear," Grace said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had spent months verifying every statistic she was about to share. "Current international education funding follows what I call the lighthouse principle. We keep building bigger and brighter lights in places where ships are already safely navigating, while ignoring the rocky shores where children are actually drowning." Her interactive map appeared on the massive screens flanking the podium, showing the stark disparities she had discovered. Hassan watched as delegates leaned forward in their seats, some taking furious notes, others reaching for their phones to communicate with their home offices. "In the past 12 months, Grace continued, international education aid totaling $2.3 billion was distributed globally. Of that amount, less than 8% reached children in the 50 most underserved regions on this map. Meanwhile, schools and universities in already well-resourced areas received enhancement grants exceeding $400 million. The numbers hit the assembly like physical blows. Grace wasn't just critiquing their efforts, she was demonstrating that good intentions were producing actively harmful results by perpetuating inequality rather than addressing it. Dr. Marie Dubois, UNESCO's Director General, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Hassan knew that Dr. Dubois was a well-intentioned leader who had devoted her career to educational access. But Grace's analysis suggested that the organization's fundamental approach was part of the problem rather than the solution. "But I'm not here just to point out what's wrong," Grace said, her tone shifting from analytical to hopeful. "I'm here because I think we can do better. I think we can do so much better that 10 years from now, we'll wonder why we ever accepted the current situation as normal." Grace moved away from the podium, a habit that always made her security detail nervous, but that she insisted was necessary for real communication. She walked closer to the assembly, making eye contact with delegates as she spoke. "6 months ago, I had the privilege of spending 2 weeks in the Zatari refugee camp in Jordan," Grace said. "I met children who had been displaced from their homes, separated from families and traumatized by experiences no child should endure. According to every traditional metric of educational readiness, these children should have been academic disasters." Grace clicked to a new slide showing photographs from her time in the camp, images of children engaged in intense concentration over mathematical problems, building complex structures from recycled materials, and creating art that expressed both their losses and their hopes. "Instead, I found some of the most innovative, resilient, and intellectually curious children I had ever encountered. Their circumstances had taught them to see opportunities where others saw only problems, to collaborate in ways that privileged children often struggle with, and to value education as a pathway to rebuilding not just their own lives, but their entire communities." Hassan remembered Grace's return from that trip. She had been quiet for days, processing what she had experienced and fundamentally reconsidering her own assumptions about intelligence, potential, and opportunity. "These children don't need charity," Grace said, her voice growing stronger. "They don't need us to feel sorry for them or to design simplified programs that assume their trauma has made them less capable. They need us to recognize that their experiences have given them insights and strengths that could benefit all of us if we were wise enough to listen." Grace clicked to her next slide, which showed an organizational chart unlike anything typically presented at UNESCO meetings. Instead of the traditional top-down hierarchy, her proposal showed a circular structure with children at the center, surrounded by concentric rings of support: teachers, families, communities, local governments, and finally international organizations. This is what I call the inside-out model, Grace explained. Instead of designing education systems from the outside in, starting with policymakers and working down to students, we design from the inside out, starting with what children actually need and building everything else around that. The revolutionary nature of her proposal was immediately apparent. Grace wasn't just suggesting reforms to existing systems, she was proposing that they abandon the fundamental assumptions that had guided international education policy for decades. To make this work, Grace continued, we need to do 3 things that will require courage from everyone in this room. Hassan leaned forward, knowing that Grace was about to make the asks that would determine whether this speech became a catalyst for change or simply another well-intentioned presentation that disappeared into committee reviews. First, we need to put children in decision-making roles, not just advisory positions. I propose that every major education initiative include a Children's Advisory Council with real voting power on program design and implementation. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Grace was suggesting something unprecedented, giving children actual authority over the decisions that affected their lives. Second, we need to redirect funding based on need rather than infrastructure. I propose a global reallocation that sends 70% of education aid to the 50 most underserved regions identified by the data I've shared today. The murmurs grew louder. Grace was asking wealthy nations and well-established institutions to voluntarily reduce their own funding in favor of places and people they had historically ignored. Third, and most importantly, we need to measure success differently. Instead of tracking test scores and graduation rates, we need to track problem-solving capacity, community engagement, and the ability of educated children to create positive change in their own environments. Grace paused, letting the full implications of her proposal settle into the minds of her listeners. She was asking them to abandon not just their current strategies, but their fundamental definitions of educational success. I know these changes seem impossible, Grace said, her voice softening but losing none of its conviction. But I want to remind you of something. 2 years ago, a hungry 6-year-old girl solved a mathematical problem that had stumped Harvard professors, not because she was a miracle, but because she approached the problem differently than people who had been trained to think in conventional ways. Hassan felt tears prick his eyes as Grace brought her argument full circle. She was using her own story not as evidence of her exceptionalism, but as proof of what became possible when intelligence was recognized and nurtured regardless of its packaging. The children in refugee camps, in poverty-stricken villages, in conflict zones, in foster care systems, they are not problems to be solved, Grace said, her voice rising with passion. They are solutions waiting to be discovered, but only if we have the wisdom to ask them what they need and the courage to give them the power to create it. Grace returned to the podium for her closing statement, and Hassan could feel the energy in the room shift from polite attention to electric possibility. So I'll end with a question that I hope will keep you awake tonight, Grace said. If the current system were working, would I be the first 8-year-old ever invited to address this assembly? Or would this room be filled with young voices offering insights that could change the world? The silence that followed was profound and pregnant with potential. Grace had not just presented an analysis or made a request. She had issued a challenge that went to the heart of everything UNESCO claimed to represent. When the applause finally began, it started slowly, but built into something that sounded less like appreciation and more like commitment. The sound of minds changing and possibilities opening. 6 months after Grace's UNESCO address, the world looked different. Not dramatically, not in ways that made headlines, but in the subtle shifts that would eventually reshape civilization itself. The Geneva Accords, as the media had dubbed the international education reform agreement that emerged from Grace's speech, were being implemented in 47 countries, with remarkable results that were exceeding even Grace's optimistic projections. But for Grace herself, the most meaningful change was happening much closer to home. She was sitting in what had once been Hassan's formal dining room and was now the nerve center of something unprecedented. The first international conference planned entirely by children, for children, about solutions to global challenges that adults had struggled with for generations. "The transportation logistics are more complex than we anticipated," said Marcus Chen, a 12-year-old from Singapore whose family had been displaced by rising sea levels. Despite having been in the Grace Williams program for only 8 months, Marcus had demonstrated an extraordinary ability to coordinate complex international projects while maintaining focus on the human needs underlying every logistical challenge. Grace looked up from her tablet, where she had been reviewing applications from children around the world who wanted to participate in what they were calling the Young Solutions Summit. The response had been overwhelming. Over 12,000 applications from every continent, representing challenges ranging from climate change and poverty to conflict resolution and technological ethics. "What if we think about it differently?" Grace suggested. Her approach to problem-solving having evolved considerably since her early mathematical breakthroughs. Instead of trying to bring everyone to one location, what if we create regional hubs connected by video? That way more children can participate, and we reduce the environmental impact. Hassan watched from his position at what Grace had renamed the adults' table, a smaller desk positioned deliberately to the side of the main planning area. His role in Grace's work had evolved as she had grown older and more capable. He was no longer her guardian making decisions for her future, but her partner supporting decisions she made for herself and others. "That could work," said Amara, now 10 years old and one of Grace's closest collaborators. Her experience in refugee camps had made her acutely aware of how geographic and economic barriers prevented important voices from being heard. "Oh, but we need to make sure the technology doesn't exclude children who don't have reliable internet access." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "What about a hybrid model? Regional hubs for areas with good connectivity, but also mobile units that can reach remote areas. We could partner with existing aid organizations that already have logistics networks in place." Hassan smiled as he watched Grace work through the problem. Her leadership style had become increasingly collaborative over the past year, shaped by her growing understanding that the most innovative solutions usually emerged from combining different perspectives rather than relying on individual brilliance. The doorbell rang and Hassan glanced at his watch. Dr. Sarah Kim from the World Health Organization was arriving for a consultation session that had become a monthly routine. Grace had begun advising international organizations on policies affecting children, but she insisted on meeting with the actual children who would be impacted before offering any recommendations. "Should I get that?" Hassan asked, starting to rise from his chair. "I'll go," said Elena Rodriguez, a 13-year-old from Guatemala who had joined the foundation after developing a water purification system for her village using materials available in any hardware store. Eleanor had become Grace's informal chief of staff, managing schedules and communications with a competence that impressed the adults who worked with them. As Elena left to greet their visitor, Grace continued working through the summit planning with her team. Hassan marveled at how naturally she had grown into leadership. There was no ego in her approach, no need to be the smartest person in the room. Instead, she had developed an extraordinary ability to identify what each person could contribute and create conditions where those contributions could flourish. "Grace," Amara said, looking up from her own tablet, "I think we need to talk about the resistance we're getting from some of the traditional education organizations." Hassan's attention sharpened. He had been monitoring the political pushback to Grace's initiatives, and he knew that not everyone was enthusiastic about children having real decision-making power in international affairs. "What kind of resistance?" Grace asked, her tone remaining calm but focused. "Some of the delegate responses to our summit invitations have been—" Amara paused, searching for diplomatic language. "They're questioning whether children are qualified to address complex global issues. A few have suggested that our work is well-intentioned, but naive." Grace was quiet for a moment, and Hassan could see her processing not just the criticism, but the emotions that came with having her competence questioned because of her age. "You know what's interesting about that?" Grace said finally. "The same people who say children aren't qualified to solve global problems are perfectly comfortable with children suffering from those problems. Apparently, we're old enough to experience the consequences of bad decisions, but too young to participate in making better ones." Marcus looked up from his logistics planning. "How do we respond to that?" Grace stood and walked to the wall-mounted display, where they had been tracking the outcomes from various foundation initiatives. The results were undeniable. Programs designed with meaningful child input consistently outperformed traditional approaches across every metric that mattered. "We respond with evidence," Grace said simply. "The Geneva Accords implementation data shows that education programs with children's advisory councils have 37% better retention rates and 42% better learning outcomes than programs without child participation. The refugee camp innovations developed by kids like Elena and Amara have been adopted by major aid organizations because they work better than anything adults had designed." She turned back to face her team. "But more importantly, we respond by being so successful that the criticism becomes irrelevant. Let them question our qualifications while we're solving the problems they've been talking about for decades." Dr. Kim entered with Elena, and Hassan watched as Grace seamlessly shifted from strategic planning to policy consultation. Over the next hour, Grace and her team would review WHO's proposed guidelines for child mental health services in conflict zones, offering insights that could only come from children who had lived through such experiences themselves. As the meeting progressed, Hassan found himself thinking about the transformation he had witnessed, not just in Grace, but in himself and in everyone who had been touched by her work. She had done something remarkable. She had proven that extraordinary intelligence combined with genuine compassion could create changes that seemed impossible until they started happening. But perhaps most importantly, Grace had demonstrated that the greatest waste of human potential occurred not because people lacked ability, but because society failed to recognize ability when it appeared in unexpected forms. She had been a hungry 6-year-old when she solved his mathematical equation, but she had been brilliant long before that moment. The difference was that Hassan had been desperate enough to pay attention when others would have looked away. Now, as Hassan watched Grace collaborate with international health officials on policies that would affect millions of children worldwide, he realized that their story was just beginning. Grace was no longer the extraordinary exception that proved what was possible. She was the catalyst, helping create a world where every child's potential could be recognized and nurtured. The real transformation wasn't that one poor girl had become influential. The real transformation was that the definition of who could be influential was expanding to include voices that had always been there, waiting to be heard. The emergency session of the United Nations General Assembly had been called for an unprecedented reason, a global crisis that traditional diplomatic channels seemed unable to address. Climate refugees numbered in the tens of millions, educational systems were collapsing under the weight of displaced populations, and international aid organizations were overwhelmed by needs that exceeded their capacity to respond. Grace, now 9 years old, sat in the gallery designated for observers, watching as world leaders struggled to find solutions to problems she had been working on for 3 years. Hassan sat beside her, both of them painfully aware that the discussions happening below were rehashing the same ineffective approaches that had failed repeatedly. "They're still thinking about symptoms instead of systems," Grace whispered to Hassan, her voice carrying the frustration of someone who could see solutions that remained invisible to those with the power to implement them. On the floor below, the Secretary General was presenting the latest statistics about educational displacement, numbers that Grace's team had provided through their real-time global monitoring system. But the proposed responses were variations on the same theme: more funding for existing programs, more coordination between traditional institutions, more planning committees to study problems that children were already solving in refugee camps and disaster zones around the world. Grace made a decision that would later be remembered as the moment when the balance of global leadership began to shift. She stood up. "Excuse me," she said, her clear voice carrying through the assembly hall's sophisticated acoustics. The Secretary General paused mid-sentence. Security personnel moved toward the gallery, unsure how to handle a child who was interrupting the world's most important diplomatic gathering. "I have something to say," Grace continued, her voice steady despite the hundreds of eyes now focused on her. "With respect to everyone in this room, you're solving the wrong problem." Hassan's heart raced as he watched Grace step into a moment that would define not just her own future, but potentially the future of global governance. This wasn't a planned speech or a formal presentation. This was Grace responding to an emergency, with the same directness she had shown that first night when she pointed out the error in his mathematical equation. The Secretary General, after a moment of uncertainty, made a gesture that would be remembered in history textbooks. "Please," he said, "continue." Grace moved to the aisle, speaking directly to the assembly. "You're debating how to manage the displacement of 50 million children from failing educational systems. But those 50 million children aren't problems to be managed. They're resources being wasted. They're solutions walking around in places where you're not looking for solutions." She pulled out her tablet, and within moments, her real-time global data visualization appeared on the assembly's main screens. But this time, the display wasn't showing problems. It was showing innovations. "In the past 18 months, Grace said, children in crisis situations have developed 847 documented innovations in education delivery, resource management, conflict resolution, and community organization. Not with adult supervision or formal programs, but through necessity and collaboration." The assembly watched in stunned silence as Grace's presentation showed refugee children creating schools from salvaged materials, developing water purification systems from available resources, organizing community governance structures that were more effective than many formal institutions. "You want to solve the displacement crisis?" Grace asked, her voice growing stronger. "Stop thinking about how to help these children and start thinking about how to learn from them. Stop asking what you can do for them and start asking what you can do with them." The cameras focused on Grace captured the moment when a 9-year-old child did something no adult diplomat had been able to accomplish. She shifted the entire framing of a global crisis from a problem requiring management to an opportunity requiring partnership. "I move," Grace said, using the formal language of diplomatic procedure with the confidence of someone who belonged in that room, "that this assembly establish a permanent children's council with voting rights on all policies affecting persons under 18. Not advisory rights, not consultation privileges, voting rights." The silence that followed was electric with possibility and terror in equal measure. Grace had just proposed something that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in global governance. The Secretary General looked out at an assembly where every assumption about who could lead and who should follow had just been challenged by a child who had solved problems they couldn't solve and seen solutions they couldn't see. "All in favor?" he asked, and Hassan held his breath as hands began to rise across the assembly hall. The world changed on a Tuesday afternoon when 147 nations voted to establish the first Children's Council in United Nations history. Grace Williams Al-Fayed, at 9 years old, became the youngest person ever to fundamentally alter the structure of international governance, not through protests or demands, but through the simple act of proving that wisdom wasn't limited by age. 6 months later, Hassan stood in the newly constructed Children's Council chambers, watching Grace facilitate a session where 12-year-old climate refugees were advising the World Bank on sustainable development strategies. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same children who had been dismissed as problems requiring solutions were now providing solutions to problems that had stumped the world's most powerful institutions. The transformation had rippled far beyond the United Nations. Grace Williams Learning Centers were operating on every continent. The Young Solutions methodology was being taught in universities, and what had started as one hungry child asking for help had become a global movement, proving that intelligence, compassion, and innovation existed everywhere, if society was brave enough to recognize them. Grace herself had grown into her role as a bridge between worlds, translating between the language of childhood possibility and adult implementation. She no longer surprised people with her intelligence. Instead, she challenged them to question why they had ever assumed intelligence was rare rather than universal. "Do you ever miss it?" Hassan asked her one evening, as they reviewed applications for the Foundation's expansion into artificial intelligence ethics, a field where children's perspectives on technology's impact were proving invaluable. "Miss what?" Grace replied, not looking up from her work. "Being just a kid with extraordinary math skills instead of a kid trying to fix the world." Grace paused, considering the question with the same thoughtfulness she brought to everything else. "Hassan, I was never just a kid with math skills. I was always a kid who could see problems and wanted to solve them. The only difference now is that people listen when I talk about solutions instead of just walking past when I ask for help." Hassan smiled, remembering the 6-year-old who had stood in his penthouse and seen patterns where PhDs saw only confusion. She had been exactly the same person then as she was now, brilliant, determined, and committed to using her gifts in service of others. The world had simply finally learned to pay attention. As Grace returned to her work, reviewing proposals from children around the globe who were developing innovations in everything from renewable energy to conflict resolution, Hassan reflected on the most important lesson their journey had taught him. The greatest transformations weren't created by exceptional people doing impossible things, but by ordinary people finally being given the opportunity to show what had always been possible. Every child has the potential to change the world. They're just waiting for someone to believe in them enough to let them try. The next Grace Williams might be sitting in your classroom, your neighborhood, or your family right now. Will you be the person who sees their potential and gives them a chance to show it? Start today. Ask a child what they think about a problem you're trying to solve. You might be surprised by what they see that you've missed.